Sorry, I'm clicking on something. So I decided to call this talk Why I Study Honeybees, and I'm going to give you some tales from the hive. And as I wrote in my abstract, some people may think, well, why can someone still study honeybees? After all, people have been keeping honeybees for thousands of years, and so many people have studied them, so surely we know everything there is to know about honeybees. But I will show you that that, of course, is not the case. Yeah, I had an issue with my changing the slide. Shakespeare probably played a really important role in making the honeybees famous for a lay audience, because in his play, King Henry V, he likened the Elizabethan society as a honeybee colony. And his idea was that if a human society could live like a honeybee society, then all would be well. There would be no war, there would be no fights, and everyone would be happy. And of course, living in the time in which he lived, he assumed that all the individuals that are of any importance would have been male. So he talked about the king of the honeybee colony. It took about another 100 years or so until people finally realized that there's actually no king in a honeybee colony, like all social Hymenoptera. They're all reigned by a female, by a queen. And in fact, all the individuals of any importance in a Hymenopteran insect colony are females. Now, honeybees are just simply fascinating, and hopefully at the end of my talk, you will agree with me. And Carl von Frisch, who shared the Nobel Prize in 1973 for his discovery of the dance language, called them a magic well. In other words, what he was referring to is that the more you find out, the more questions you can ask. And that has definitely been my experience all these years working on honeybees. I started as a beekeeper just for fun, and then that became my job. I mean, the best job in the world, really. But just to make sure that we're all on the same page, I have to give you a little bit of basic bee biology. And I apologize if you know all this, but if you don't know, then you won't be able to understand some of the things I'm going to talk about later on. Now, honeybees are haplodiploid, like all Hymenoptera. And that, of course, means that the males have one set of chromosomes, they're haploid, and the females are diploid. And in the case of the honeybees, we have, let me just see if I can move this away. There it is. In the case of honeybees, we have two castes, female castes, the queen and the worker. Now, how does this all happen? Because the males are haploid, when a female lays an egg and she does not fertilize it, she produces a son. And if she does fertilize it, she produces a female. And a honeybee queen has complete control over fertilization. So she mates once, and then she stores all the sperm throughout her life. And she decides to either open a valve and let some sperm out to make a female, or she keeps that closed and then she produces a male. Now, she doesn't mate just once. Honeybee queens are actually extremely promiscuous. They go out once or twice in their life, at the beginning of their life, and they mate with 10 to 20 males, it says on this slide. But we've actually found instances where honeybee queens have mated to more than 50 males. Now, the colors in this color scheme show you the relatedness between the different, or amongst the different individuals in this colony. Now, if a queen, of course, gives her half of her genetic material to all her offspring, including her sons, and we have a mixture of workers that share the same father, we call them super sisters, and workers that only share the mother because they have a different father and they are half sisters. And all the individuals that are fathered by different drones are called petrolines, and I'll use that word later on. Now, one thing that is really important to keep in mind is that there's no genetic difference between the queens and the workers. An egg, a diploid egg, is laid either in a worker cell, which you see on the left. The worker cells are rather small, You probably know them if you looked at a honeybee colony. That means that there's not a lot of space to have a large larva grow in there. Also, a larva that's present in a worker cell is fed a different kind of diet, especially for the first few days, compared to what we see on the right-hand side, which are queen cells. So these are the big cells, and the white stuff you see in there is the larva, but also the royal jelly that individual is being fed. Now, you can actually move an egg from one cell to another. If you move an egg from a worker cell into a queen cell, it will happily be raised as a queen. So the caste differentiation here is triggered by epigenetics effects and not genetic effects. And these themselves are set off by the different diets. Now, the workers are by no means not sterile. They can lay eggs, and because they're haplodiploid and the males are haploid, that egg, because they cannot mate, will turn into a male. Now, this is also important to realize that because the workers are not necessarily all full sisters, if you now take an average worker and calculate her relatedness to the average male produced by all the workers, then we get to an average of 12.5% or 0.125 because of this high level of promiscuity of the queen. The queen, when she produces a son that will be a full brother of all the workers, their relatedness to their brothers will always be 25% or 0.25 because they share half of the queen's genetic material because the sons do not have a father. So from a kin selection perspective, the workers would like to make their own sons lay their own eggs, but they don't want their half-sisters in particular to do the same. So if everyone would try to lay their own eggs, you would think that this becomes a complete mess, the colony doesn't function, and such a colony would quickly be selected against. So that's one, there's a genetic disincentive for individual workers to lay their eggs. But it gets even better, because if they would lay their own eggs, then other workers would start to police them. Policing is a word that Francis Rednick came up with in the 1980s. So he had this idea that workers should police each other because it is against their genetic interest to have the half-sisters lay eggs. And here are beautiful photos that Francis once took. So here he put a worker-laid egg in a cell. You see that in the left-hand side. A police worker crawls in, she sniffs it with her antenna, she realizes it's not laid by the queen, and she eats it. And that's what we call worker policing. How does she know? The queen is capable of leaving a signal on the egg, which we think is chemical, but no one has ever been able to identify it. And the workers are unable to mimic that signal, so they can't pretend that they're laying a queen-laid egg. Now, the combination of this kin selection and a very effective worker police force has led the people to predict that workers should basically be functional sterile. Now, Kirk Fisher in 1989 decided he was going to test this, and he indeed found that only 0.12% of all the males in the colony were offspring of workers. And this number has stayed gospel, almost gospel, for a very long time, basically until this young chap came around, Michael Holmes, who was one of my PhD students. So Michael had decided he was obsessed with honeybees. He was not really good in the lab. He wanted to do experiments actually with bees, and we love designing very simple experiments. So we decided to test this idea again that workers do not lay eggs because it simply didn't fit with what we had seen over all these years working with honeybees. So what we did is we divided the reproductive cycle of a colony into 3 reproductive phases. One is the pre-reproductive phase, when the colony is building up, because they need to build up in order to be able to reproduce. Then there's a reproductive phase where a colony is producing young queens and males. And then there's the post-reproductive phase where a young queen is starting to get herself established. Now, Michael went out to his colonies every week. If there were male brood present, he would collect them. He would then genotype them to see who laid them, queen or workers, and he would also dissect workers to see how many of them had active ovaries. And this is what he found. So here we see on the x-axis the 3 reproductive phases, on the y-axis the percentage of individuals, and what I'm showing you here is in green the drones or the males that were the offspring of workers. And in the red, brownish actually, we see the workers that had active ovaries. Now, hopefully you'll see that there's something strange. If we look at the reproductive phase, we see that there's a peak in the number of males that were produced by workers. But that also coincides with a period in which the fewest workers had active ovaries. In fact, the highest peak of workers with active ovaries was found in the post-reproductive phase. Now, what is going on here? Michael could figure out which of the petriolines, remember these are individuals that share the same father, were the most likely to lay eggs. So this is what he did, or were the most likely to have active ovaries or produce drones, I should have said. So here he numbered the petriolines simply based on their frequency of occurrence. So this is a frequency distribution. And so number 1 is the most frequent, and that's also the most boring, so we're going to ignore that. In blue, we see just the normal workers that were genotyped and belong to that particular petrioline. In brownish red, again, we see workers with active ovaries. And in yellow, we see worker-laid drones. Now, under normal circumstances, you would expect that you see something like petrioline 1. We have a lot of workers of that petrioline. They activate their ovaries and they produce drones. But that is not what we see. We see some petriolines that are very good at having workers with active ovaries, number 9, number 20, and the 4, and we won't talk about. We can talk about it in the questions. And then we have very rare petriolines from 19, 21, 22, etc. onwards. They are rare because Michael never found normal workers that belong to that petrioline. He only found evidence of those petriolines in the form of their male offspring. So these are rare petriolines that are clearly geared towards being very successful in producing drones. So what does it tell us? Well, how can you become a successful cheater? And I say cheating because workers are not supposed to lay eggs. Well, what it shows is that activating your ovaries is not enough, because you also have to be able to evade this police force. But also timing is a good start, because what is the point in producing a male if there are no queens to mate with? And this explains this pattern here. So we identified 2 types of wannabe cheaters. Actually, we put 1 and 1 together to come to this conclusion. So the workers that you see in the middle that are so successful in producing drones during the reproductive phase, they are the anarchistic workers. We knew that anarchistic workers existed. These are workers that lay eggs despite the presence of a queen. And they are apparently quite successful because they actually produce drones. And then in the post-reproductive phase, we see rebel workers. Rebel workers were named by a Polish group, and they found that if workers, or when workers are being raised in the post-reproductive phase, and I should have mentioned that earlier, when the honeybee colony swarms, the old queen leaves the colony. When the virgin queens are still being raised, they're still larvae or pupae, and then there's this period in which the colony has no queen. That means that queen pheromone levels are very low, and the workers that are growing up then, they're larvae or pupae at that time, they react to that by increasing the number of ovaries that they have, and they're more likely to activate their ovaries, and they will call the rebel workers. And they're basically ready for when there's never a queen in that colony, so at least in that colony can produce some drones, and in that way transmit genes to the next generation. So these are the two different wannabe cheaters, but actually only the anarchistic workers are really successful because they can also evade the worker police force. But this then made us think, okay, fine, you have these anarchistic workers, they can produce some drones, but how likely is a drone to actually mate with a queen? Of course, so the question really is, how useful is it to produce a male? Now you can have a special male, so this is Jesus from South Park, but honeybee workers don't tend to produce Jesuses, they produce drones, which you can see fly here. So this cloud here is a drone congregation area, and all these boys are after this one individual, which is a queen, and this is from a beautiful film, More Than Honey. It's very staged, but the principle is the same. Drones compete tremendously over access to females, virgin queens. Yes, she mates with 10, 20, maybe 50 different males, but there are thousands of males in one of those drone congregation areas. They only mate once, and then when they're successful, they fall down and they die, as you will see now. So the probability of an anarchistic worker actually transmitting her genes to the next generation is very low, because she may only be able to produce 5 or 10 drones in her whole life, whereas of course a honeybee queen will produce thousands. So then we thought, well, okay, there may be another bee that might be much more clever, and that is this beautiful creature here, the Cape honeybee, because it lives in a beautiful landscape. This is the winelands of South Africa near Stellenbosch, which is in the south of the Western Cape. And I simply love working there, not in the least because the wine is quite stunning. It is challenging. The bees can be quite aggressive, so often they don't want us anywhere near people. And in this particular year, they put us in a paddock with very, very curious cows. The cows were too dumb, though, to realize that there was a correlation between them knocking over one of those boxes and them getting stung, and they always remained very curious. Now, why is the Cape bee so special? It is special because females can lay on unfertilized eggs that result in female offspring, because something weird happens during meiosis where two of the meiotic divisions come back together to restore diploidy, and we call that sterility, or female birth. Now again, it must have been sometime in the 80s, a South African theoretician, Jaco Greef, he's actually sent me his paper when I was doing my PhD, and he made this prediction that sterility changes everything within a Cape bee colony, because workers now produce clones. So that now means that an individual worker can't care less whether her sisters or half-sisters produce clones of themselves, because whether they're talking about their sister or the daughter of their sister in genetic term, that's exactly the same story. So Jaco predicted that workers should not police, and Cape honeybee should not police, and workers should constantly try to lay eggs. But no one, to my surprise, had actually ever tested that. So we went back to South Africa. And again, very simple. We went to our colonies and we kept sampling worker brood, in this case, genotyped it, and we got this particular result. So sometimes there were no worker-produced workers, other times there was a high proportion of worker-produced workers. And that seemed to coincide again with the reproductive phase of the colony. So here we have the first queen cell, and if we average over all the colonies, we see that before queen cells were produced, we see that about 3% of all the worker-produced all the workers are worker-produced, which is still much higher than Michael found in his study, but afterwards there was about 20%. Now you may wonder why produce workers when a colony is actually producing new queens. We think this is simply because when the colony is producing queen cells, new queens, queen cells are being built, but only a few of them. And you can just imagine that you're a worker and you're ready to, well, I can't imagine because I never laid an egg, and I doubt any of you in the audience has, but just hypothetically, I can imagine that you're gearing up to lay eggs, and then you can't lay it anyway because there's no queen cell, and then you just pop it into a worker cell. So that's my hypothesis why we see this increase in worker-produced workers after the new queen cell. Now, and that is interesting for this reason, as I said at the beginning, there's no genetic difference between a worker and a... So that then made us think new queens in a Cape honeybee colony. Is it the queen, as it should be, or is it actually the worker or a worker? So again, we went back to South Africa. Actually, we went back many times because this is a lot of different experiments, but they all came to the same conclusion. 60% of the young larvae that we collected from queen cells were the daughters of workers. But it gets even better because it turned out that 40, or actually 38% of those 60% of queens that were daughters of workers were laid by individuals that did not belong to that colony. They were offspring of parasitic workers. Now just think about this. We're now talking about an individual that's going to take over the colony. She's going to be the reigning queen, and this colony is raising a queen to which they are not related at all. That is quite bizarre. From the workers' point of view, it's pretty cool because they are reincarnated. They really are, in genetic terms, reincarnated. So they cannot mate because they're workers, but they can clone themselves. And if they are the mother of the next queen, then they, in genetic terms, are really reincarnated as a new queen. And that, I think, is a pretty cool trick if you can't mate, because workers cannot mate. Now, the person who we work with whom we work with in South Africa, Mike Alsop, he is extremely skeptical. So at some stage he said, okay, all these studies, wonderful, but what you're doing is, or what we were doing, is every time there's a queen cell, you sample the larva is really small, and yes, they are produced by workers, but it could well be that if you leave them alone, they are not viable and they will be removed. So when you look at an adult colony, or an adult virgin queen or a laying queen, she will never, it may well be that she will never be the daughter of a worker. So we went back to South Africa and waited until a new queen was happily laying, and lo and behold, Mike also was wrong, because we did find that there are worker-produced queens that are very viable and happy running around and laying eggs, including ones that are daughters of parasites. Okay, so that was another question, another thing that came out of the magic well. Then we started thinking again, okay, so these workers can clone themselves, but what about the queen? We know from lots of studies that it's good for a social insect queen to mate with a large range of males, because having a genetically diverse workforce is very good for a whole set of reasons. So she has to mate, fine. She has to produce workers which are genetically diverse, also fine. But what if she decides, now I'm going to lay an egg in a queen cell and I'm not going to put any sperm there, I am going to clone myself? That would be the wise thing to do if the queen is really geared up to maximize her own transmission, the transmission of genes to the next generation. It's not far-fetched, because ants can do it, the little fire ant, for example. And of course, we all know the honeybees are better than ants. So if ants can do it, then why shouldn't bees be able to do it? Okay, from other studies that we've done, we know that if a Cape honeybee queen is not mated, she can produce both male and female offspring. This is by using a trick, which is basically knocking her out with carbon dioxide. This is a trick that honeybee breeders use because they have to knock out a honeybee queen if they want to inseminate her. And then they realize that carbon dioxide itself is enough to let a queen start to lay eggs because somehow she thinks that she has mated. We also know that once she is mated, apparently she never produces asexual offspring, female offspring, because she still produces the male asexually. So this made us wonder what triggers or prevents cloning by the queen. And for a long time, I had in my head, there's something about her thinking that she has mated. Once she is mated, she can no longer produce clonal offspring. Maybe, or maybe it is the actual sperm in the spermatheca that prevents her from cloning herself, because now there's conflict between the male in the form of the sperm and the female. So we came up with this crazy idea that we had to make a queen think that she has mated without using any form of narcosis, because that changes the physiology. So what did we do? We came up with a queen chastity belt. I know it sounds completely bizarre, and many times we thought we were going to give up, but we finally managed to get surgical tape. We used all sorts of different things. We found that surgical tape glued with nail polish did the trick. So this queen is not narcoticized, but we have to put her in a little tip to prevent her from moving too much. And then we carefully glue her abdomen so she cannot open her sting chamber, which is she needs to do when she mates. Maybe you can remember that from the video that I showed earlier. So here we have a queen that is with her chastity belt in a colony. It looks different now because the workers actually tried to get it off. And then the point was we had special hive entrances so we could watch the queen when she wanted to go out and mate. If she had her chastity belt on, she was allowed to go out. If not, she had to stay in. And the next morning we would catch her and put a new chastity belt on her. If the chastity belt was off, she was allowed to fly. And then we closed the colony again, waited for her to return to check if she still had a chastity belt on, and then she was allowed inside. So here I am checking one of our boxes. These bees can be very stingy, to check whether the queen tried to come out or not. And experimental work can be very frustrating because we didn't know how old the queens needed to be. So it was a lot of days wasting time because none of the queens were seen. And here is a queen. She wants to go out, but she lost her chastity belt, so she wasn't allowed to go out. Try again the next day. And here is a queen that is now trying to return, and hopefully you can see she still has a belt on, so she was allowed back in the colony. Then the next day we would carefully take the chastity belt off, which we also managed to do. Otherwise, of course, she could not lay any eggs. Now here's the frustration. We started with 10 queens. 3 of them actually flew, but 2 got lost, never to be seen again. And we had 1 perfect queen who did everything we wanted. And then some of them, they never flew. We never saw them at the hive entrance. They didn't care, apparently, about flying, but at some stage we noticed that they looked very swollen, as if they were full of eggs. So we decided to take the chastity belt off, and lo and behold, they did start to lay eggs. And what we found, they all laid males and females, and these females were clonal. So this does seem to suggest that once the sperm in the spermatheca, the females are no longer able to not use that sperm if they produce females. And why do bees, queens now no longer have to fly when you put a chastity belt on them? We have no idea, but it almost seems as if just manipulating their backside can be enough to trigger them to start laying eggs. So these are a few tales of the hive. The tales are, oh, sorry, I should have showed this earlier. This is basically what I just said. But what I really wanted to say now last is that, of course, I could never have done any of this work without all my trusty collaborators. At the top is Ben Oldroyd, my partner in crime, in many different ways. We spend a lot of time in South Africa playing with these bees. And below are South African collaborators, Mike Alsop and Christian Fransman. And I thank you for listening. And I'm thanking the internet that my internet held up. Thank you. I shall stop sharing.
Thanks, Madeleine. That was
Pleasure.
absolutely great. Minder, can I take care of the online questions and then you can take care of the offline questions, if any? Okay.
Hello, Sutiraj.
Huh.
There is a question from the student.
Yeah, go ahead.
नहीं इंग्लिश में बोल।
तो जो क्वेश्चन है कि जो चार्ट दिखाया था कि क्वीन ने बर्थ दिया डॉटर्स को, तो उसमें से एक ही क्वीन बनी, तो फिर जो डॉटर्स थी उनके बीच में क्या डिफरेंस था कि वही बनी? और तो मतलब कोई उसने डॉटर्स तो इतनी सारी दी, क्वीन एक ही की बनी।
Okay, then there is a question from 5-year integrated student Priya that Yashika and Madeleine has shown a chart that out of workers, one is has the potential to become the queen or was selected as the queen. So what was the reason why other workers were not selected?
Why the other workers were not selected?
Yeah.
I think that's just sheer luck, which one becomes the queen. So it's honeybees are a bit complicated and they're a bit cruel as well. So if the first queen that emerges in the new queen that emerges in the colony, so the only reason why honeybee queens have a sting is not to defend the colony, but to kill their sisters. So the first queen to come out in a cell from her cell will seek out the other cells and sting through them to kill the sisters. If multiple queens come out at the same time, they will fight to the death, and the workers will just stand there and look at them. They will not interfere. They won't do anything. So you just have to be the first one out, and then you're the lucky one. So does it mean you're the first one who the first egg that was laid, or do you have some way of speeding up your development? Some probably can speed up their development, and then they have a leg up because they can kill their sisters. They're not very nice, actually, these queens.
So that's all, Sutir.
Okay. So because Sahu is asking, why do other workers don't eat eggs laid by patrilines?
Well, they can't. That's a good question, but they can't discriminate. There's all sorts of reasons why, if you just look at a kin selection argument, I can increase my genes if I preferentially help my super sisters and ignore my half sisters. So I let my super sisters lay their eggs. I don't police those, but I police the ones from my half sister. But the truth is they do not have the information that they need. They cannot tell. The only information they have is whether an egg is laid by a queen or whether it's laid by a worker, but they can't tell which worker laid it. So it's, one of those great examples where theory predicts, well, this is what they should do, but in practice, they can't. They just don't have the information.
Professor Gadadkar has something. Archie? You are muted.
You.
Yeah.
I just typed a question saying, any idea how the sperm force the queen to use them?
I suspect it is something passive, come to think of it. So when she lays an egg and she wants to lay a female egg, and of course she makes a decision based on the size of the cell. So she knows, well, this is a worker cell or a queen cell, so I have to add sperm. She probably just opens the valve anyway, and either there's no sperm in there or there is. And the other thing is, in order, the development, what is it? There's something very strange going on, that fertilization actually happens in honeybees after the egg is laid. But the process of fertilization is done by the queen making some special movement or something. So they have to be squozen. The eggs have to be squozen. Do you know more about it?
If it's a passive process, then it's not conflict between the sperm genes and the queen genes.
Yeah, but of course there's the causal and proximate. Anyway, conflict sounds nicer, but you're completely right. Things sell better when you call it a conflict between males and
But
females.
if there's something active, then I would have more likely to sort of call it as conflict if somehow the sperm force themselves
Yeah,
out.
but I mean, but does it mean then that cryptic female choice can be also seen as
if the queen is incapable of laying an egg without opening the valve, then it's really no credit to the sperm for that in that sense.
No.
And there will not be selection on a male to increase the probability that the sperm is being used if it's a passive process. If it's an active process, there could be selection on the male to make that happen more often.
Yes, granted.
Thank you.
I actually never really thought about the mechanism until you asked that question. So people asking questions is always really helpful because then you're forced to think about it. Oh, you're right. Yeah. But how can you test it, whether it's passive or active? I have no idea.
Genetic variation in males for their propensity to be used, even the queen is trying to do. If there is variation, already it suggests something. If there is genetic variation among males.
Yeah, but since they're so promiscuous, you have a lot of variation anyway. Anyway, there's lots of things.
In their propensity to force the queen to use them. So if there are some males who, for some reason, are not able to do that, and so on. Anyway, so maybe there are other questions we should.
But, yeah, but then you don't find them because they won't be represented. Yeah, we'll talk more.
Yeah.
We'll take one last question from Javed Mullah, who asked, is there any difference in pheromones produced by worker queen bee?
So the daughter of a worker, the queen daughter of a worker. No, so they're completely normal queens. The other experiment we've done is because I thought that if you're the clonal offspring of a worker, so you're basically a clone yourself. So if you're then a queen, then surely you yourself would also produce clonal offspring. But no, those queens, worker-produced queens, are totally normal queens. So they mate, they have the same pheromone bouquet, etc. They're indistinguishable from a queen-laid queen.
Okay, I guess there aren't any more questions, so we'll probably stop this talk over here. Thanks, Madeleine. Thanks a lot for joining. And thanks to the internet for asking.
I know, sometimes it works.
Right.
I'm very glad.
Okay.
Thank you so much.